Well, hello and welcome to the Oregon State Capitol Foundation Speaker Series, and I'm Bruce Anderson, one of the board members. This series is sponsored by and brought to you under the Capitol History Gateway Project. And if you have a chance, you should check out the events page at OregonCapital.com or pick up one of these the event cards, which I don't have here, but they're somewhere around here, and see all of the programs and events we have planned for this year. Today's presentation is aimed at Oregon history in honor of the 160th anniversary of statehood that we are celebrating today. And if you were here, you'd be able to go get a birthday cupcake that they have down in the Galleria. They're delicious. I speak from personal experience here. So, today's speaker is Dede Montgomery, and Dede is a sixth-generation Oregonian whose family ties have instilled in her a deep connection to the land and curiosity about life in early Oregon and the stories, good and bad, that lay here or lay there. Dede's relatives include two of the earliest Oregon white residents, Chloe Clark and William Willson, who arrived with the Jason Lee Missionaries and founded Willamette University and Salem. J.K. Gill, the early Portland bookseller, Richard G. Montgomery Sr., author of The White-Headed Eagle, and her father, Dick Montgomery, Titan of the Willamette River. Dede received her BA in biology at the University of Montana, her MS in environmental health sciences at the University of Washington. So I guess we can say, go Grizzlies and Huskies, right? Yay. And is a certified industrial hygienist working in research at OHSU, where she blogs in Oregon and the workplace. Although a scientist, Dede once began a story about her love of the Willamette while in a creative writing class taught by William Kittredge at the University of Montana. In her book, My Music Man, Dede explores the jumbled path of forgiveness, reconciliation, courage, and gratitude through memories and stories stirred after her dad's death. She'll be signing her book in the Galleria after today's presentation. Please help me welcome Dede Montgomery.
Thank you so much. Thank you all. It's great to be here, and I appreciate those of you that have come into the room to listen to this. And thank you, really a huge thank you to the Capitol Foundation for inviting me to be here today. I really can't imagine a bigger honor than to be at the Capitol on our birthday to share my stories. So thank you so very much. So that introduction said a lot, actually. Thank you for doing that. My book, as was mentioned, I share stories that span 7 generations of our family in Oregon, back to Oregon country time, and particularly in the Willamette Valley. But for today, what I'm really going to focus on are the stories of Chloe Clark, or Chloe Clark Wilson, and William Holden Willson, and that is Wilson with 2 L's. That's quite important. But before I do that, just real quick, a little piece, come on in, about my book. When my father died 4.5 years ago, you know, I felt that sadness that we all feel when we lose people that we love, and they're never around long enough, we feel. But in addition to that, I felt this big loss over the loss of a storyteller. For my dad, Dick Montgomery, or Richard Gill Montgomery Jr., was a storyteller. He loved to tell stories about the rivers in our area, the Columbia, the Willamette, and certainly about old Oregon days. And that's really what caused me to write this book. Dick Montgomery grew up in Northwest Portland, attended Chapman Elementary, Lincoln High, and graduated from the University of Oregon in journalism. Barely, he would have told you. He had a career that spanned from advertising, which he really didn't like, into newspaper businesses, including one of his favorite, which was editor and publisher of the La Grande Observer. And he even had a short stint here where he worked in 1970 driving from Wilsonville here to work for the Attorney General, Lee Johnson. But really, his real career, as he would have said, was for the Port of Portland, where he retired as the Maritime Public Affairs Manager. And he knew everything about our rivers, from today, or at least a few years ago, the trade to the history. And those are the stories that he really left so many of us with. And so it's really that storytelling that I mourned also. This picture reminds me to make the comment of the stories that we really all hold, and how really so much of my book is about the power of story and how important it is for all of us to share our stories. And I so appreciated Kim Stafford this morning as he shared his poem for today. And one of his quotes was, "This is the time for Oregon heroes." So there are new stories that we all, and especially our younger generations, need to help us create so we can tell those stories and learn from them as well. This picture, which is certainly the only picture I believe I have holding hands with any of my four brothers, taken by my father for ad copy for an ad for United Sewerage. And it reminds me of that time period. For those of us that are kids, that were kids in the 1960s, we grew up knowing Governor Tom McCall, and those that were working so hard to not just clean up our rivers, but to help keep Oregon the state that we so love. And so this really reminds me, and so much of my book, I will tell you, is not just about Chloe and William, but it is about all of those stories. But let's go back. Let's go back to my great-great-great-grandparents. This is the only photo I have of William Willson. William Willson left New England in 1837, traveling with the Jason Lee Missionaries. As a layperson, he was the carpenter. He was to be the mission carpenter. He had been a mariner, whaler. He loved adventure. But he also had attended Reverend David Leslie's church in Massachusetts and believed he could certainly help carry the Christian message to the Oregon country. He arrived, well, before he arrived, he worked on board alongside Dr. Elijah White, and he read a couple of medical textbooks. So that was where he got a little bit of medical training, so he believed that that might be useful also when he arrived in the Oregon Territory. By the way, he arrived he was 31 when he arrived here. He met John McLaughlin, as did all of them. Remember, they came by sailing ship on the ship Diana, traveling up the Columbia River, back when we knew it was difficult to move sailing ships up the Columbia. And within a few years, we had steamboats that did it so much better. Once arriving at Fort Vancouver, he met Dr. John McLaughlin, and along with a few other members of that group, they basically brought all their supplies and passengers by canoe upriver to the McKay Landing at Champoeg, which it was then transported overland to Willamette Mission. Now think about it, they did have to portage around the Willamette locks, and they received the assistance of Native Americans who, as I understand it, charged 5 rounds of ammunition and a handkerchief for the chief. At least that's what my story is. That's what I've learned. Soon, so William was doing his carpentry assignments, and at one point was sent up to Nisqually, which, remember, this is Oregon country. That's Puget Sound today, but no Puget Sound recognized then in terms of the words we would use to describe that area. And he was starting to build the mission, the Nisqually Mission House. So we need to talk now about 3 years later, in 1840, my great-great-great-grandmother, Chloe Clark, arrived with what's sometimes called the Great Reinforcement, also with the Jason Lee Missionaries. She was the youngest missionary, 21, to be the school teacher. And they came on board a 400-ton first-class sailing ship. In addition to carrying passengers and their belongings, they had a grist mill, a sawmill, farming implements, and certainly had an idea of what they might need here to get the beginnings, their beginnings, at least in Oregon. And the cost was $42,000, which I would imagine was a fair amount of money to get that, the support, the benefactors to get that. Very soon, Oh, and by the way, she had left, I never said where she came from, East Windsor, Connecticut, whereas William had come from New Hampshire. And she was assigned to be the mission teacher at Nisqually. And I actually am going to just do a couple of short readings today, and I'd like to do the first one here. Maybe I should show you a picture of her. This picture, by the way, is the only one we have of her through family. A tough 8-day journey carried Chloe as she joined Dr. John Richmond and his family over the 150 miles from Fort Vancouver to Fort Nisqually. The Nisqually Branch Mission served as the earliest of local mission Protestant efforts and the northernmost of the 5 Jason Lee Methodist missions, or missionary stations. It also included Willamette Falls, Clatsop, the Dalles, and the most favored and largest, Willamette, which was closest to here. Nisqually Mission was located in what is today DuPont, Washington, that's just south of Tacoma, with its elementary school, Chloe Clark, named after her. To get there, Chloe's small missionary group canoed 50 miles down the Columbia, spent 2 days navigating up the Cowlitz River, and then they traveled after departing from the river, they traveled 3 more days overland in carts and horses, where they were finally welcomed by a Hudson Bay Company representative at Fort Nisqually. Chloe initially taught as many as 50 Native American children. Again, she was considered the first teacher in that region. But as we know, Native population was dwindling due to the introduction of diseases brought by whites, diseases like measles and influenza, smallpox. And by that time, by the time she had arrived, 28,000 Native Americans had been killed through disease or died because of disease in Western Washington, leaving fewer than 10,000 survivors. Here is the school that exists today, a kindergarten through 3rd grade school in DuPont, Washington. And that's certainly one of the things that Chloe is known for. And I will have to tell you a very, I think, sweet story about this school. I had the terrific opportunity I was invited by the principal this fall to go speak to the 3rd graders at this school. So it's kindergarten through 3rd. And what I learned as I made my way up there was that every year on her birthday in April, the students and teachers come out to the statue, this beautiful statue, and they sing happy birthday and they have cake. So here's a photo of me talking with 3rd graders, and we talked about what Chloe knew in her life, but I loved hearing what they thought about what times basically in their neighborhood might have been like. I was really a rock star that day. I think that's the biggest rock star I've ever been in my life, seriously. So they were up there for a while. The next spring, just a month after she lost an infant that was born prematurely, she and William received orders to move to, and this is obviously a picture from today, but to the Willamette Falls, or what was called at the time is Willamette Falls. At least that's what the spelling makes it look like. They had a very difficult journey. Their time up at Nisqually wasn't a great time. It was pretty clear many of the Native Americans weren't thrilled to have them there, as we probably know through many of our other stories we've learned over the years. At the falls, Chloe, although she did capture in her letters the amazing images of fish jumping through the falls, which we've been able to see documented by artists rendering that memory, she also really expressed how frustrated she was, that she didn't realize she would arrive and have so many different languages spoken by the Native Americans. And it was very difficult for her to imagine communicating as she thought she might be able to. Additionally, the way the peoples were so nomadic, traveling and moving, she realized she would have a very difficult time making an impact. And, really it was that missionaries' lack of both cultural understanding as well as any acknowledgement that they might give to the Native Americans' long history here in settling the West. Both of those things probably contributed significantly to the failure of the mission schools. Anybody ever seen that photo before? So I took that photo upstairs on a previous visit, and I was thrilled to be in the house gallery earlier today and see it up on the wall. What this speaks to is really my next little point to make about William Willson, is that he was appointed by his peers as one of the 3 secretaries as he joined 41 other men on May 2nd, 1843, in the voting for the provisional government of Oregon country. We still were not Oregon Territory. And I do like this photo. I should be able to mention the artist who's captured on there. I can't see well enough, so my apologies to the 1930s artists that rendered that. I don't have anyone who has truly confirmed this for me, but I do believe, based on everything I know, that that's probably Willson in the dark coat holding the paper, because he was one of the 3 secretaries. And it looks very much like a similar painting that exists today at Champoeg, where he is identified. Again, remember, we weren't Oregon Territory until 1848, so we're still pretty early. But the decision was to create a government, create something until we could finally be part, what they hoped, of the United States, so that they could control some of the issues they felt that they were having. And some of you have probably seen this monument at Champoeg that honors those white men who voted in support of that provisional government. And William and all the other names are on that monument. I have a chapter in my book about Champoeg. It's a pretty special place to my family. We went there the day after my father died, my brothers and Russ and my at least one daughter and my mom. So it really has a lot of meaning for us. Around this time, they're still at the falls, and Chloe was really torn between her desire to convert Native American people, and yet her ever-present fear of violence, as well as just not really feeling like she was doing what she thought she was meant to do, at least not do it as well as she thought she should. And yet she also worried that people would consider it a failure if they left. And I will go ahead and start another reading. This is from chapter 15, Chemeketa. And then, just a few years later, William and Chloe did call it quits as traditional missionaries, leaving the Willamette Falls for Chemeketa, where Chloe choosing instead to, quote, give a proper direction to the youth of our country. And I'll mention, we have a diary of Chloe's, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit, which is why we know a lot about what she did say or feel at the time. There, the couple made what historians today identify as their real mark in Oregon history, founding the town of Salem and Willamette University, and referred to over a century later by Willamette University as Salem's first power couple. The Oregon Institute opened in the fall of 1844, so it looked something like this picture, as the first school for white American children and those with both white and Native American blood west of Missouri. This Oregon Institute moved into the frame of what was originally the failed Indian Manual Labor School. The structure and land had been purchased by the missionaries for $4,000. William kept busy, and he did this for the next few years. He had done this as well, living at the falls, where he might travel around as what was called an itinerant preacher. And he also delivered a little bit of medical care, although I found at least one historian referring to him as a quack, But so I don't really know how good his medical care was. But what we know about the school is Chloe was the first teacher. She initially had 5 students. And soon after, young women or girls particularly would catch a steamer just north of the falls and get off at the landing here, the Wheatland Landing, and they would board with her. So Chloe and William lived in this school for a bit of time, as did students who were boarding there. William served as first treasurer of the new provisional government, later participated in the Oregon Exchange Company, if you've ever heard about beaver dollars in Oregon City, so he would travel back and forth a bit for that. He ran for territorial delegate to Congress in 1851, but lost to Joseph Lane. Many historians believe that he was the one to rename Chemeketa, which of course came from the Kalapuyan's language, Chimeketi, I believe. I may not be pronouncing that correctly. But he was the one to rename it as Salem. And I understand it triumphed over a few other names, such as Corvallis, Multnomah, and even algebra. I don't know. He's recognized as the city's founder, creating the first plat of the city, and owning the original land. He and Chloe owned the original land where we stand today, as well as Willamette University and much of Salem. And we'll talk more about that land claim in just a little bit, because it was somewhat controversial. But before I get there, as settlers, we certainly know about the 1850 land donation claim that gave title to people for this free land, white people. We certainly know our state history of the racist laws that we enacted as well during that time period. But as more settlers did arrive in the West, William and other Institute trustees worried that people might jump their land claims. And you commonly read about this in early Oregon history. They didn't know how they could protect their land claims. And so what they did is each of the 4 trustees had their own land claim that they had applied for, and they went ahead and thought that if they surveyed and filed a plat map, that would protect their land. And then eventually they could sell town lots to further build on Willamette University and to provide funds for that. And so William filed the map for downtown Salem that was 13 by 5 blocks, and there is a map you can still see of this at Willamette University in the archives. The school continued to grow, and in 1846, William built their first home down on where we now have Boise Cascade land, down near the river. But let's move on. Chloe and William had their first child, my great-great-grandmother, Frances, in 1847. This is the only photo I do have of her, so you can see she's almost 10 years old here. They had 2 more daughters later. William went on and bought first a general merchandise store, and soon after a drugstore, of which he sold half of his share, just a year or so before he died. During that time, I'll just tell you about the land controversy. So we know that the Donation Lands Claim Act was passed in 1850. And when that happened, there was a little disagreement between the trustees and the Wilsons about their land. So if we recall that any white man who had a wife, they could together get 320 acres rather than the 160 acres. And that was the first time, as I understand it, that women were included to own their half share. So William had agreed that his land would certainly be for the Institute. But because half of the claim was legally owned by Chloe, she said, I never signed that agreement. And so the controversy was basically resolved. And I should back up and say during that time, Chloe was still teaching. She was the teacher. William was a trustee. But they resolved it basically. And the decision was that a line was drawn to split the property in half along State Street. Right here, right? And 160 acres to the south would belong to the university. And the 160 acres to the north would belong to Chloe. And of course, eventually that land was given and sold over the years, and it's where we stand today. In 1856, William died at the age of 51. And, you know, he was a terrific storyteller. And they say, kind of like my father, they say that he died laughing, telling a joke. Within the next year, Chloe decided for the first time to return east and visit family. So she packed up her 3 daughters under the age of 10. And of course, rather than coming and going back by steamship the way she arrived, not steamship, sailing ship, I have to kind of look at the details of this. They traveled by stagecoach over the mountains of California, ship to Panama, train across the Isthmus of Panama, ship again to Boston, and train to Hartford, where she stayed with family. It wasn't until 1863 that she returned to Oregon, but she did return to Oregon. And the story says her grown daughters weren't so sure they wanted to come back, but they did all come back. She took on the job of governess of the ladies' department at Willamette University, and she provided lectures, such as one called The Sphere of Women. I really would love to meet my great-great-great-grandmother today and be able to chat about those things. Her house, that they had built a house, William and Chloe, prior to his death, located at Capitol and Court Street, really almost just outside, right? And in 1880, it was moved, after her death, it was moved onto Willamette University campus as Lasan Hall. So that is a dorm, as I understand it today. It was rebuilt. So certainly, I think in the 30s or 40s. But it was especially, it's supposed to look kind of like this. They built onto it. This was not what her house looked like, but they took that structure. And it was the beginnings of Willamette's music school and Willamette's college, or the women's college, excuse me. William's lasting gift, of course, as some know, I know my good friend Chuck knows this, is that Wilson Park, or sometimes now called Capitol Park, is a public square between the Capitol and the courthouse. I thank the Salem Public Library for this wonderful 1890 photo that shows that park a little more clearly. And really, William believed that Salem should preserve open spaces, similar to the common spaces that he had seen in early New England towns. Now, what some of you may not know is J.K. Gill became my great-great-grandfather because he met Chloe when she was back east. And he was a 20-year-old college student. He was having eye problems and studying very difficult languages, and thought a trip to the West when she came out might be fun. So he traveled out and he enrolled, as I understand it, well, actually taught the first fall term at Willamette University. And then he went back east. He finished up his degree as a teacher, came back again, and then he basically married my great-great-grandmother, Frances. So that was Chloe and William's oldest daughter. She had gone ahead and graduated from Willamette University, by the way, a few years after they had returned. She was a graduate 1 year with 4 other students, I believe. J.K. Gill basically first took over the drugstore, the half of the drugstore that Chloe had owned, and really put effort into the books and stationery. And then within a couple of years, I think the date on here is 1866, is that right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. He opened a bookstore in Salem. So this is a photo of that 2-story brick bookstore. It was located at 356 State Street, and I did look at Google Maps to determine, I believe that's where the Taproot Lounge and Cafe is today. I think. Don't quote me. But times were changing. Steamship travel, of course, was happening frequently between Portland and Salem. The stagecoaches would stop in Salem on their way between Portland and San Francisco. And although Salem now had 1,100 people around that time, about just after 1866, 1870. In 1871, J.K. Gill and Frances, with Chloe moving with them, moved to Portland. They had realized Portland was going to be the larger city, and it might be the place to continue to do, of course, to continue to be a bookseller, which is certainly what J.K.'s name is, known by so many of generations of Portlanders for. He established the J.K. Gill Book Company, which I'll mention in just a couple minutes. Chloe died 3 years later at age 56. So it's amazing to me to think about all that they did between two people who passed at 56 and 51. They were buried at the Salem Pioneer Cemetery right down the street here, and I had the opportunity to go and, of course, see their headstones. But I don't believe that we've had family live in Salem since then. I really want to thank, I'm going to mention a couple other people in my family in a moment, but first I really need to honor the organizations in our state that protect history. Namely, with Chloe and William, I would give certainly a huge shout out to Willamette University. This is a screenshot of some of the things you could view in their archive library, including the plat map, I understand is there. They also undertook an amazing feat a few years ago where they took the diary, Chloe's diary, that had been donated by family in 1935, and they put it online. So anyone can get on and look at that diary. Now, it's very difficult to read, I have to tell you. I'm really glad I have a typed transcript. But it's really amazing. So I give really just huge thank yous to Salem, or to the Willamette University Library, also to the Salem Heritage Center, and then, of course, the Oregon Historical Society. And I would also give some thanks to the Museum of the Oregon Territory as well in Oregon City. I want to just show a couple final photos. I mentioned J.K. Gill Company. That operated for 150 years in Portland, sold outside of family in 1970, and the store finally closed in 1999. But some of us probably remember going into that store. I see some heads nodding. I love this 1914 newspaper advertisement that depicts the 1893 store. And anyone interested in J.K. Gill, I have blogged a lot about him on my personal blog, Musings About Life in Oregon. This is another wonderful photo of J.K. Gill and his two of his daughters, climbing Mount Hood in 1892. This is a family photo. They, as I understand it, they horse and buggied to base camp and then hiked up. And of course, and that would be my great-grandmother, Georgia, on the left, and her sister, Kate, on the far right. But look at those outfits for those women. Man alive, right? This is J.K. Gill with 5 of his daughters in the 1930s. He had one son who must have decided he didn't want to be in the photo. I'm not sure. This one circled is his daughter that would become my great-grandmother, Georgia. Georgia married this guy. His name, he was involved in early Portland opera and also was in many men's singing groups. His parents came to the U.S. from Ireland, which is where I get my love of Irish music, I have to say, and my grandfather had it. But this was William Montgomery. He showed up in Portland in the late 1880s, and he had gotten a business degree. And J.K. Gill needed a little help financially. And so he started working for him, and soon after married his daughter. It's a theme here. This is Georgia holding my grandfather, who in my book I call Daddy Dick, Richard Gill Montgomery Sr., and his sister, Anne Frances Montgomery Brewster, who we called Aunt Nan. And they both, I would say, there's oral histories on both of them through the Oregon Historical Society, which I really appreciate listening to their voices that were taped in the 1970s. This is Daddy Dick, or my grandfather, Richard Gill Montgomery Sr., older. And he had, a number of things. He was an advertiser. He worked for J.K. Gill as a general manager. He was an author, and that was mentioned in the introduction here. He wrote 3 books on Northwest history. Probably the most known is The White-Headed Eagle, which was about John McLaughlin. And it's part of why I think I always thought John McLaughlin was family until I got old enough, because it was a common name in discussion growing up. I mean, he was a true historian. I will always tell people, I am not a historian. I love history. I try to write about it, but he was a historian. This is another, I have just a couple photos left. This is 1930, J.K. Gill, a year or so before he died. My father's grandfather, okay, my great-grandfather. So that is my father as the baby on the lap. He was born in 1930. On the right is his brother Bill Montgomery, who some maybe knew. He was a bit of an interesting character, an advertiser, and he passed away just a couple of years ago as well. I need to mention Sam Gill before we finish here. So Sam Gill was one of the brothers of J.K. Gill, and he came out to Oregon in the 1870s, I believe. He worked in the iron industry at first, got laid off, and then discovered steamboats. And he was a steamboat engineer, traveling up and down the Columbia especially, but also the Willamette. And he was a writer also. So his log and many stories he wrote called Memories of Steamboat Days are protected also by the Oregon Historical Society. So great stories. And few of you have read my book. I dedicate quite a bit of time to this man. My grandfather was quoted as saying he would have loved to have written a book about him if he could have gotten enough information. My father, in the obituary that he wrote himself, said that this is the man, Sam Gill, the stories about him, although my dad was just a baby when he passed away, but that this is the man that gave him his love of steamboats and river history. So I'll end with this photo. Some of you know that photo. A couple of you were there when we did my dad's memorial service on that boat. That is the Oregon Maritime Museum that is moored down in Portland, near Tomahawk Park, Steamer Portland. And it's a wonderful, if you've never been on that, it's a great museum to go on. I had a great opportunity to do a book reading on it during a tour last summer. That's my father, way up. I think I can do this. That's Dad up there. I think in the late 1990s. You can't really see him very well. And actually, I think it's after that. He was the president of that Maritime Museum during a year that they did a lot of refurbishment of it. So it further really reminds me of just the power story. The different stories. We all have different stories. I think they're all important. And there's good stories and bad stories and happy stories and sad stories and hopefully stories that we all learn from. And again, I would honor the comment Kim Stafford made this morning, which is really about continuing to create good stories. I think that's what was really interesting for me in writing this book, is looking back through the lens of today, through what some of those stories were. And you want to have conversations with people, I think, about the whys and the hows and all of that. So I think with that, I didn't even talk about statehood, did I? So this is all before. This was becoming, in the Oregon country, Oregon territory. So statehood occurred when?
1859.
That's right. February 14th, 1859, quite a few years after. William had already died by that time, before we became a state. So So I'm happy to be here, and I think I maybe have enough time for a few questions, if there's any questions. And then I'll be signing books outside in the hall. So any questions? Or any corrections? You know, I would say I never profess to be, you know, to be a historian. I love history. And I try to keep it all in my brain, but it doesn't always stick really well. Yes, there was a question, and I will repeat it for the audience.
Oh, well, when you mentioned the early days, when William was coming up the Willamette River, and you said circumvented the locks. But it was actually Willamette Falls. The locks hadn't been built yet.
Oh, did I say the locks?
You said the locks.
Oh, excuse me.
So
it's
the locks
because
were built until 1873.
so that I'm being corrected, and thank you. I appreciate that. I think so much about the Willamette locks these days because we're so excited to maybe get them moving. But I did not mean to say the locks. So the speaker is absolutely right. I should have said when William and others made the journey up the Willamette, they needed to circumvent the Willamette Falls, which they did by portaging. Thank you very much. So thank you all very much. I so appreciate this, and have a great day. And I think there's still cupcakes outside.